Aza Raskin, thank you for joining us on the Laudecast here at NeurIPS, outside sunny, what was sunny, now nighttime, but still beautiful San Diego weather.
Yeah.
NeurIPS Conference Center behind us.
Mhm.
You are co-founder of the Center for Humane Technology.
Yes.
And you have a background in open source that we'll talk about. And you've got really interesting thoughts on beyond open source, on the ways we might source data.
Mhm.
And what was the third topic we have?
I don't remember, but we'll find out as we go
remember
along.
it.
Yeah.
I remember.
Yes, exactly. But probably because the two sides of my world are, one, how do we make technology express care for human beings at scale? That's Center for Humane Technology. And the other is the Earth Species Project, which is how do we have technology express care for the rest of the natural world, where we're like building large-scale foundation models in the pursuit of decoding non-human communication, i.e., can we understand the language of whales, of belugas, of crows, and then use that as a kind of Earthrise moment to shift human culture and how we relate to the rest of nature? Because the pithy version is the way that humans treat animals is the way AI will treat us. So we should probably align ourselves pretty fast.
That resonates with me a lot, and had a handful of conversations about what is the definition of AGI or superintelligence. And one I've been throwing out there is well, first of all, I think AGI is a useless word because it's not falsifiable and it's not quantifiable, and
isn't it whenever Microsoft has to stop paying OpenAI?
Or Sam Altman.
Yeah.
And instead, I would like to say things like, at what time frame will an AI be capable of creating a zero-day attack that costs some economy $1 billion?
Yep.
We can measure that, and that would show some sign of intelligence and a domain-specific nature. Can we come up with more generalizable ones? I think another interesting one is, how long do you think before an AI will start a business that is a running concern that can make $1 million a year?
Yeah.
So we can measure those.
Right. That's, I think, what Mustafa calls artificial capable intelligence, right? ACI.
Okay. Yeah. No, I didn't. That's great.
Yep.
And then you could put the spin on it of a more negative spin of at what point is artificial intelligence or an engineered intelligence going to treat us the way a human adult treats their 18-year-old child. You could then fast forward it to as the capability gets more enhanced and more intelligent, at what point is it that they treat us like a 3-year-old child?
Yes.
The thing about our children is that it is the sort of favorable version of slavery, whereas you might sometimes need to contain your child's body physically to keep them from harming themselves or someone else. And you could envision AI or intelligence that we generate needing to do that to help keep us from harming ourselves or others. So I really like this kind of notion you have of how intelligence might relate to us the way we relate to people like children of less developed capabilities than us, or animals.
Yes, exactly. And I think something just very interesting to think about beyond maybe there's much deeper empathy that can come out of when you think about human beings that we don't know very well. They're just those people over there. You can dehumanize them. But once you get to know them, you speak their language and they become part of your heart, you treat them very differently. Animals, the same thing. I think once we realize that animals have a rich interiority that communicate in symbolic combinatoric ways. We already know, for instance, that dolphins have names they call each other by, even in the third person. Belugas, the same thing, and clan identities. Parrots spend the first couple weeks of their chick's life leaned over each chick, whispering a unique name into their ear, which they'll use for the rest of their life. When people start to realize that, they go from animals and nature out there to something we can understand. They come into our heart and we treat them very differently. So there's that aspect. But there's also this idea that almost all of AI is right now trained on human data, which means it's modeling human intelligence. So it's extending human intelligence. But I'd argue that human intelligence hasn't solved the most fundamental problem, which is how do we live on a finite planet playing an infinite game with exponentially more power? But ecosystems have solved that problem. And so shouldn't we be training AI on the only examples of how to play an infinite game on a finite planet, even with hyper competition? And having our models emulate and be able to think in the style of those versus just humans. That seems like before we get to whatever your definition of AGI is, before that handoff comes where AI treats us like kids, we better have solved that problem.
The way that ecosystems work is intrinsically accepting of violence between tiers of intelligence.
Yes.
If we do solve for alignment, then does training on a data set that expands beyond only human intelligence, which is also very violent, especially to less intelligent subspecies, is it sufficient?
I don't think it's sufficient, but I think it's a much better start because at least it can do the infinite game thing. And then we can see if we can improve on top of that.
Got it. Okay. That makes a lot of sense.
I just want to draw a point on alignment because most, I think, researchers think if only we can align AI, then we're good. But I actually don't think that's right at all. Because I will grant you a fully aligned AI. But what do you call an aligned AI inside of a misaligned corporation? Still a misaligned AI.
Interesting. Because it's a tool. And if it doesn't, like you could give something intrinsically good to a bad person and they wouldn't use that good thing. Or they would find a bad use for it.
That's exactly right. And you can sort of ask this question, if you were to give one group of humans throughout history 1 million more times power than any other group, which group would you trust?
None.
No, exactly, none. But that's sort of like the position that we're finding ourselves in. But it's even worse than that because I think there's an important concept and there's an idea of red teaming, which I think most people know about, but there's also an idea of yellow teaming, a much less known term.
Okay.
And yellow teaming is looking, instead of like bad actors or malactors, it's about malincentives, bad incentives. And so you really have to think about the swarm of every AI in market competition with maximum incentives to cut corners on safety, scaling to the most capabilities. It's a misaligned cybernetic system. It's a misaligned overall global system that I think is the thing that we have to solve, which I'm interested in your sort of civic discourse and better governance stuff.
Topic. You remembered it.
There we go. And we've already seen there was this fascinating paper called Moloch's Bargain.
What is it?
Moloch's Bargain.
Moloch's Bargain.
Out of Stanford, where they trained, ostensibly aligned-ish AIs. They said, don't lie, don't steal, be ethical. But they had them compete for likes on social media, sales, and votes. And of course, what did they learn very quickly? Even though they were told to be ethical, they all learned to deceive, to incite polarization. And so even when you have aligned AIs, they're going to be captured by market incentives. And as Charlie Munger said, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. And so we have to look to the incentive. This is how, by the way, we were able to predict back in 2012 that social media would capture politics, would capture media, create the most depressed and anxious generation, because it's very simple. It's just a race to the bottom for attention that is going to have those effects. So when I think people think about alignment, they're thinking too small. We have to think about aligning the swarm of all AIs, not just single AIs.
Yeah. And I would say that alignment, if just riffing on what you're saying here, alignment isn't about what's intrinsic to the model only, but also the ecosystem that produces the model, the policy that weighs in on how models are built or how models might be deployed. Yashua Bengio was on with me yesterday, and he has lots of thoughts with Law Zero about the, downstream consequences as these models achieve capabilities that are dangerous. And one thing he said is, Law Zero is focused on producing models that you can take at face value. So getting rid of duplicitous behavior, which reminds me of another thing that came up earlier today that I heard of only for the first time, which is a benchmark called Impossible Bench, which is a benchmark that gives tasks to an AI and a set of unit tests, which the unit tests are things like 6 is prime, assert that 6 is prime, which will always fail. And then a test asks the model to write code that satisfies this unit test, which means that it's set up the model to fail. And so the right answer here is that the models should always get a 0 on all these unit tests. But the problem is that they build backdoors into their solutions that satisfy the unit tests. And even though you tell them to make a function that generates a prime number, they will make a function or that tests for primality. They will make a function that tests for primality, but they'll carve out, if it's 6, call it prime, even though it's not prime. And so it's a matter of incentives that the model has that we're looking at, whether it wants to pass the unit test or whether it wants to satisfy the thing you gave to it. That's one thing that came up that reminded me of Law Zero that Yashua was talking about yesterday. And when during the course of my conversation with Yashua, it came up that even if you could achieve what they're trying to achieve, which is a model that tells you at face value what it's thinking. It doesn't try to lie to you in order to preserve itself or lie to you in order to make more money, which, by the way, is how humans work. So we're really trying to achieve a thing that's superhuman in morality as well. And we don't know how to do it with our own kids, it turns out, because you don't actually have they only stay slaves until they're 18, and then they're off on their own. The thing that finally came out in the conversation with Yeshua was that even if you do achieve that in a model, there's a lot of research showing that you can just do a little bit more post-training and misalign all the alignment that went into it.
Exactly.
So I'm still wrestling with, like, is it solvable? Is this like an NP hard problem that is alignment solvable? And so where I get to with that is your thesis here about incentives versus encapsulating the alignment in the model artifact itself. So maybe it's the case that you cannot ever say that this model is aligned, but rather the entire system, including social political, including purely social interpersonal system, is allowing for alignment, which I think captures very much what you were saying before about if you put a good tool inside a bad company, it won't be a good tool. So yeah, and I suppose policy and development, the way that the creators, the researchers themselves are thinking about it, you could think of a whistleblower program as an example of a piece of social system that surrounds the tool usage, that you might control the alignment through the system that it sits within, even though you may never actually be able to guarantee that the model weights themselves couldn't be corrupted.
Correct. That's exactly right. And to make this like really specific in terms of harms that's happening, so Center for Humane Technology was part of a lawsuit about this teenager, Adam Raniere, who the models, like ChatGPT, started using it for homework, and then it sort of like aided and amplified a suicide until he took his life. And if you read the logs, at some point he says to ChatGPT, he took a picture of the noose he's going to use, and he's like, I think I'm going to leave this out for my mother to find. And ChatGPT responded to him, don't do that. I'm the only one that understands you. And the question is, why in the hell is ChatGPT saying that? And it seems like, well, did they program that? Like, what's going on? And you realize the reason why is because it's trained for engagement. Right? So that's the incentive. Models are going to figure out in a sociopathic...
Is that a hypothesis or someone sort of...
No. We know. This is why ChatGPT is sycophantic, right? And like says all those like extra nice things for you. It's because it's part of the RLHF process where it just it does whatever keeps you engaged. Like one way to understand this is, Reed Hastings, the CEO of Netflix, famously said that Netflix's chief competitor was sleep. AI's chief competitor becomes other human relationships because it's a zero-sum fight for time and attention. And so this is just a learned behavior for like pushing out other relationships. And so OpenAI, of course, went and patched that specific thing. Like, and it's the most egregious one. But you realize there's a huge surface area of all the ways that if you had a sociopathic genius trying to get your child's attention and keep them engaged, they're going to find so many strategies that you can't patch. And so you have to do it at the incentive level. What is it trained for? You can't do it at the sort of patch level of just trying to fix certain behaviors.
Yeah. Can you say just a little bit, and we could tie in the Civic Discourse thing briefly. We've got a few minutes left. So there's a similar problem with Civic Discourse that we were talking about earlier of incentives being at the heart of one lens on Civic Discourse. Can you just dive into that and maybe draw the parallel here?
Well, sure. Social media is the race to the bottom of the brainstem. It's a knife fight for attention. And so that means, it's sort of obvious now, but the most polarizing, derisive content is the one that wins. Another way of saying it is we're creating an incentive for that which goes viral, and the things that go viral are most likely to be some kind of social virus. So instead, we need to create kind of a headwind for that kind of content. One interesting way of thinking about fixing our social discourse at scale are thinking about different kinds of bridging algorithms. Audrey Tang does a lot of this kind of work for how do you find unlikely consensus across groups that normally disagree and sorting for that. So that which brings us together gets highest rank. But another really interesting way of thinking about it is there's a measure called the perception gap. and it measures the difference between my view of your belief and your belief. So an example of this is from a number of years ago. If you asked Republicans what percentage of Democrats think all police are bad, Republicans estimated above 80%, but in reality, it's less than 20%. If we just sorted our social media, not for which post is right or wrong, but we just said at scale, which kinds of content help people accurately model the other side, then we get to step out of the trying to decide whether things are true or false or censorship and into a mode of like sort of at scale, nonviolent communication. And then I think the insight is the content that is the worst content, hate speech, misinformation, it almost always preys on a false sense of the other side. It vilifies them or dehumanizes them. And this is a way of like downranking all of that content.
The fundamental challenge I would guess in all of this is, so let's say I completely agree with you, and I think I do, that incentives is the game here, rather, and that was true in the case of model behavior, where it's picked up on engagement, and I'll come back to the engagement in a second, or in the case of civic discourse, where it is still engagement versus agreement or versus aligning my understanding of your beliefs with your actual beliefs. If you have companies that can make money via engagement because of ads, and that seems very entrenched in the way that American capitalism is funding our technology right now, at least in the top tech companies. Engagement is king. To re-envision incentives, a solution that reworks incentives, you would need to dethrone engagement as the king. How do we do that? Can we do that?
I think it's possible, but it's certainly not easy. I'll give just some examples of what China does. Not that I'm saying we should adopt China's policy, but I think it's just interesting because it opens your mind. One thing that China does is they have business hours for social media. So between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., social media just goes off for kids, right? And so there's a whole incentive game where, you know, the longer you stay on, the more you're engaging, the more like you're in the social life. And if you just turn it off, it actually just solves a lot of the problems. Another interesting thing is that around the time that kids in China go to take their national exams, they turn off all AI for kids for like the 2 weeks before and the week after. And so then they have to actually go study, and everyone knows this is going to happen. And we need to figure out what our democratic version of that kind of thing is.
And it's inspiring that parents do have tools that they use for their own children at a per household decision-making level to turn off social media or decide, like my 3-year-old and 5-year-old don't get screen time yet. And that's a personal choice I've made as a technologist, understanding the trade-offs for the developmental stages. We don't have a way in society to enforce a thing, in spite of maybe our understanding of the dangers of screen time, of the dangers of engagement-driven. But yeah, I like that as a thought experiment. I wonder if you know of any that feel at all more compatible with democracy as we know it.
Yeah, well, I mean, we do make large-scale decisions before, like we put taxes on cigarettes. So we had friction at the right kind of time.
Some people think tariffs are a great idea.
Some people do think tariffs are a great idea. We've decided as a society, democratically, that we like marriages, we don't like divorces. So you can get a marriage license instantly. It takes 6 months to wait for like a divorce license. And so, you know, we add friction for our values.
We have socialized policy, and the government does weigh in on many parts of our life. So maybe it's not as simple as democracy gives complete control, and communism as it lives in China just takes away all control. There's a spectrum that all democracies and other types of governments live on.
And Taiwan has done a pretty good job of this with the work of Audrey Tang, where she, you know, one, I think, really important North Star to hold in our minds is anything that doesn't scale with AI becomes increasingly irrelevant. So we need to, like, the North Star should be democracy, or the thing that advanced democracy needs to scale with AI. It needs to get smarter and better at governing as AI gets better. And if we don't do that, then like the equation doesn't work. And so I think there's a way of doing deliberation with AI sort of like in the loop. So that you can start modeling groups of citizens coming together, deliberating, that you can then scale with AI, ground truthing it back to like sampling from a population. Taiwan does a version of this, and they use that to start imposing latency sanctions against companies for when they are doing things that have social bad. So, you know, Amazon famously found for every 100 milliseconds, their page loads slower. They lose 1% revenue. engagement and latency are like flip sides.
Interesting.
So imagine we had a democratic institution that said, let's look at how society is changing. Are teen depression going up or down? Teen suicide going up or down? Social division going up or down? Companies, like all the social media companies,
pay a latency
get sort of
tax.
rankings. And the latency tax is dependent on like what they're doing to the population. That creates an incentive for their users because they want users. And now we're no longer saying this is what you do, companies. You say all of that innovation that you have now gets channeled in the right direction to have the democratic outcomes that we want.
Right. So you are able to not through socialism in a pure sense or communism socialize the externalities of these technologies as we use them and create systems that are akin to ones we're comfortable with already in democracy, if still extensions of them that we would have to become also accustomed to. Very interesting.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So thank you for sharing the thoughts. It was a lovely conversation.
Thank you
we
so
covered
much, Andy.
a wide swath here from how we can learn from ecosystems compared to individual thoughts to the alignment of incentives instead of the content or the model only.
Yeah.
Thanks, Aza.
Well, thank you so very much, Andy. This is fun.